This session is sponsored by the Village at Stonebridge, and we're very pleased to have Tammy Shabilo, the Vice President of Business Development, here on their behalf to introduce our speaker. Please show our thanks for sponsoring this session.
Well, this is better than we had the first session. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Once again, Luther Care Communities is a proud sponsor of your educational sessions. This year, we felt it was noteworthy to share a little bit more about Luther Care Communities with you. Although the Village at Stonebridge, the video that you see running, is our newest project, we indeed have been doing business for Saskatchewan for 65 years. This year we'll celebrate 65 years serving Saskatchewan only. And the reason that's important is because the ethic of Saskatchewan is an integral part of the work that Luther Care Communities does. About every 15 years, over the last 65 years, we've developed a new community. Each generation brings different needs, different means of aging in place, growing older is defined by that generation. Many people ask us, how could you go from being a nonprofit into a profit? And building strong, sustainable hometowns comes from public-private partnering now in this arena, not just government funding in the health region. So we wanted to invite you all to seek me out this week while I'm here. We are looking at rural expansion. We currently, in our 2020 to 2023, have 3 rural municipalities defined for intermediate care growth, which is a big gap in the healthcare region, as we all know. And I want to invite you all to look at what's happening in your communities as it relates to land acquisition or opportunities in resort villages. We're finding a lot of opportunities coming our way with regard to third-party management, putting together partnerships that are meaningful to each individual community. We don't have a cookie-cutter process or plan that we bring out, and each one of the developments we've done have been unique in every way and have served that generation. The one that you see that I'll play the video for in a moment is our newest generation of living, and it does address the aging senior in Saskatchewan who's enjoyed traveling a great deal, who understands dining, who wants food choices, who wants to do what they want to do when they want to do it. That's part of mental health. People who have worked in Saskatchewan for many years and now have options, keeping them in Saskatchewan and allowing them to age gracefully within their every economic genre that they may have experienced throughout life is equally as important to offering subsidized housing, which we do at our tower project we built in 1978. You might know that we have a project on Meewasin Trail. We're in Outlook, we're in Estevan, we're going back to Unity in the next couple of years. We built the original project there. So please seek me out. Once again, it's a delight to be here with you today. And I want to introduce our speaker. Before I play the video, I'll do that as I go off. Let me just pull up his bio. Really, my computer didn't work, so I'm on my phone. Forgive me. Ian McCormick is the president of Strategic Steps Incorporated, a company that provides advice, assistance, and capacity to local governments throughout Western Canada and into the territories. Ian works in the space that connects elected officials and senior municipal managers, concentrates in areas of strategy, sustainability, good governance, and ethics. His company primarily provides council orientations, strategic and sustainability planning, and governance audits and reviews. Over the past year, Ian has worked in 3 provinces, 2 territories, and 2 states, assisting small and large municipalities in both rural and urban settings. Ian has worked for provincial government, in the nonprofit sector, and in private industry, so he is well versed in what success looks like in all of those environments. Ian and his family live in Sherwood Park, Alberta, just outside of Edmonton. Please help me in welcoming Ian to the stage.
So I believe you're going to play your video?
Yes, I just wanted to play.
There we go. So we're already 100% better than we were last time. This is Groundhog Day. So this is the second time we've done this presentation, of course. My wife pointed that out to me as I was leaving home yesterday, that it was the irony was not lost on her, doing the same presentation twice on the same day. The other thing we know we're up against, and we were just trying to do some time zone figuring, is Super Bowl. So we understand we're scheduled to be done before kickoff. Those of you who need to leave, I will assume that that's what's going on. If we've got our time zones wrong and actually kickoff is now and you start cheering, I'll just assume you're cheering for me. That's because that next makes me feel better. We're going to spend the next little while talking about ethics. We're going to be talking about how you perceive ethics, because ethics can be situationally specific. We're going to talk about the good things of ethics, some of the pitfalls of ethics, and some of the tools that we've got available to us. If this works. There we go. So here are the topics for today. A little bit about us. Tammy mentioned it a little bit. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. I was talking to CAO Call from Yorkton just beforehand, and it brought me back. We were out there doing a council orientation a few years ago, and it was probably the coldest, blizzardiest weekend ever in Saskatchewan. I'd rented this mid-sized vehicle here in Regina to drive out there. I got here and I actually ended up renting a four-wheel drive Audi, because I wasn't sure I was going to make it the whole way. So it's nice to see some people we've had a chance to work with. Tammy mentioned we got a variety of experience. We've worked around Western Canada, I think in all 4 Western provinces. This is an interesting experience too, because this kicks off the year for me. We're working here today, and I'm going to Cranbrook on Wednesday, and working in Alberta in the meantime, and then the following week I'm in Virginia. And so I'm kind of all over the place. One of the interesting things I see, no matter where we are though, is that the principles of good governance are the principles of good governance. Whether you're in a formal strong mayor system or a formal weak mayor system, whether you are in a place where mayors can vote or mayors can't vote, the principles of good governance tend to be fairly consistent. And they're all kind of based on that golden rule, do unto others sort of thing. Although my 12-year-old says, do unto others before they do unto you. And I'm not sure that's exactly what it means, but that's her assertion. So anyway, that's a little bit about us. I'll talk a little bit about some stories a little bit later on too. So we're going to talk about introducing ethics. I'm going to get you to talk about that. We're going to talk a bit about what ethical practices are, some examples of it where you would see it, some pitfalls that you might find for yourself where ethics maybe don't come into play or have fallen apart. We've got some tools, and then we're going to wrap it up at the end of it too. We're supposed to be wrapped up in a little less than an hour. This is being recorded, I understand, so it will be available somewhat later. I don't know if it's live streamed or if it'll be available later. So if you're cheering, cheer loudly. If you're going to boo, keep it to yourself. Talked a bit about us. We do a lot of work on strategic planning and sustainability planning and orientations. The idea behind all that stuff is to set up good governance before you really need it. If you're trying to close that proverbial barn door after the horse has left, it's far too late. If you're trying to establish rules of procedure or comments about ethics at a time where you're at loggerheads with a member or 2 of your own council, that's too late. What we're trying to do is set these things up in advance. You've already got pieces of paper that you've signed on a code of ethics. You've taken your oath of office to your community, but sometimes that turns out not to be the worth of paper that it's written on. We end up trying to figure out among multiple versions of the truth which one is real. Facts can be subjective sometimes, even though they ought not to be. We do reviews and audits for local governments too. So sometimes if something's going wrong, there's some smoke, but we don't know where the fire is, we can come in and have a look. And we work with dozens of municipalities around Western Canada throughout the year. So we have a pretty good idea of what good governance looks like. Had a really interesting experience late in November last year. I spent 2 days up in Nunavut doing an orientation for all the brand newly elected mayors for Nunavut. There are only 23 of them in the entire territory. Principles of good governance, the principles of good governance remain the same, even though their model of local government is significantly different than ours. Now, 2 days in Rankin Inlet, because of the blizzard, turned into 5 days in Rankin Inlet. But that's just the way it goes in northern travel, so I understand it. So we some other comments there. Where are we? There we go. So, sorry, mine up here is not linked to yours. If we look at what ethics is, if any of you have does anybody here have a degree in philosophy? Would anybody admit it? Okay. Ethics, any of you who've taken political science or many humanities-based programs will have run up against courses on philosophy or ethics. And there's a couple of quotes here. I just want to point out the high points around. The first one being, ethics shape the way that we use our power in terms of duty and virtue and truth. This was written by a fellow by the name of Leonard Apedale, who wrote a book about ethics in governance in 2019. I've got a list of it. I've got the resources at the end of it all. It's a very good book. It's written by an Alberta author, so it's about local government and ethics in local government, and it's quite interesting. The second comment here is a definition of ethics. It talks about ethics being a system of moral principles, that it's good for individuals and for society. Ethics comes from the Greek root of which means custom, habit, character, or disposition, meaning it's the way we do things now based on a history of the way we've done things over time. So when you say we've always done things that way, that's some of where this comes from. All provinces and territories have legislation around local government. Some, like you, will divide them up into multiple acts on local government. Some will combine all local government into one. You have acts around freedom of information. You have acts around local elections. And some of you will have acts around things like freedom of information. And these will provide us with a skeleton of what we understand about ethics, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what ethics is, and that ethics can sometimes be situational. Fundamentally, ethics is about ourselves, how we use power that's been given to us by members of our community. And the philosophers have written about it for thousands of years, and they talk about whether people are fundamentally good, meaning if left to their own devices and nobody was watching, they'd still do good things, or whether people are fundamentally bad. Now, bad to me often means self-interested. That if nobody was watching, they would do things that were in their own interest, even if they were to the detriment of the larger group. We see this expressed in local government sometimes, too. When we work with communities, the healthy communities are ones where elected officials believe they are fundamentally public servants. They're not there they're there to make the community better. They want to leave their municipality better when they're finished than when they started. Then there's another group of elected officials who are just mad about stuff and got elected because they want to be the boss and they want to tell people what to do and how to fix it. And these are often in the one-issue candidates. They get elected because the dogs are too noisy, or they get elected because the potholes are there's too many potholes, or we don't like the city manager. So you dealt with that 6 months into your term. What does that person do for the next 3.5 years? And that's where we start rubbing up against some of these ethical quandaries that show up from time to time. Most important is how we deal with one another. And coincidentally or not coincidentally, that's the business that you're all in. You are fundamentally in a relationship-based business. If there were no people in your community, there'd be no need for for elected officials, and there'd be no need for municipal administrations. You're there to help people work together. If all the decisions that you were being asked to make were easy decisions, only one of you would actually have to be there, but you have scarce resources. You have to figure out where you spend that last dollar, where the most impact is in that. And you are going to disagree with your council mates quite frequently, and that's healthy for debate. But people with a strong ethical foundation who are there to serve their communities can rationalize that and can break the personal away from the political. And that's quite healthy. When we see ethics, when I ask people what ethics mean to them, oftentimes they describe it as the inverse. We can tell when something is unethical, but sometimes it's hard for us to identify things that are ethical. And that's what we're going to explore here over the next little while. So with that in mind, I would like to take a couple of minutes just asking you to explore something amongst yourselves. So I've got a couple of questions, and depending on time, we'll go through them. So I'd like you to find 2 or 3 friends, colleagues, people you know or not, around you. And I'd like to pose this question to you. Are ethics situational? How are your elected official ethics different from your personal life ethics, if they are at all? So I'd like to broach that, get you to broach that. So I'm asking you, when you're on the job, do you use a different ethical structure than the one you would use at home, with your family, or at church, or at work if you're not a full-time elected official? So I'd like you to take 2 or 3 minutes, find a friend, if you can. Find a friend and just pose this question to them. Are ethics situational? How are your elected official ethics different from your personal life ethics? So I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. So, Jeff. Okay, a couple more minutes. Okay, let's come back and talk about this if we can. I posed this question to the group earlier, just after lunch, and it was interesting to see how consistent the responses were. People used different words but said very similar things. Is there anybody out there who's willing to, well, first of all, I haven't dealt with politicians who aren't willing to talk, but is there anybody out there who's willing to give me their opinion on whether they think that our ethics situational? Does anyone want to pipe up on this? What would you like to say?
They definitely are situational because one of our examples was if I'm spending public money, I'm going to be very honest, open, and transparent. If I'm spending my husband's money, it might be a little bit different.
I don't know if you all heard that. She suggests that she's very honest. Her husband's not here, I'm presuming. She said it's situational. If I'm spending public money, I need to be very open and honest and transparent. If I'm spending my husband's money, she says, it's different. Attention. I want to give you Tim's card. There you go. So it's always tough to get the first one to speak. That's the only Tim's card there is, though. Is there anybody else? Is there anybody else who wants to argue, say that maybe ethics are not situational? Or anybody want to say anything?
It all depends on where you come from.
Okay.
From a little town that's all wanting 900 people. Now everybody in that town, be it in church group, in council, and my husband, they know everything about you before you really do something. So you can't be one place at one meeting and another place at another place. They're going to take it.
You're saying that ethics may not be situational in this case, that you've got to be consistent. Because even in a large city, some of you will be from some cities, you're still a bunch of small communities. Community used to be very geographical, me, my neighbors, my neighborhood. Now communities are much more interest-based. It's my church group, or the curling club. It's my knitting club that my wife belongs to, or red wine club, as she calls reading club. She's not here either, by the way. Although this is going to should have thought of that. So what that means is that if you're in your community, people do know if you are being consistent in your ethical framework at home or at work or wherever the group happens to be. So those people who aren't consistent are the ones that tend to get tripped up. Somebody always finds out if there's that inconsistency. Was there anybody else who wanted to have one more comment before we go?
I think that with true ethics, it shouldn't matter who's watching.
Okay.
You know, like that situational, you're going to get tripped up or they're going to find out. True ethics, it shouldn't matter if anybody's watching at all, so I don't think it's situational.
Okay. Ethics is not situational. A true ethical person will not be situational. They'll act the same in this situation, this situation, this situation. You might reserve what you say if in a council meeting versus at home over dinner, but same framework. Okay, thank you. Thank you for accepting a gift. I'm not sure if you have ethics around accepting gifts from strangers.
If it's under $10, I think we're okay with it.
No. One of the things we will talk about a little bit later when we talk about things like conflict of interest is gifts. And that is, local governments, elected officials receive gifts in a couple of ways. You receive gifts on behalf of somebody who's coming to the municipality and wants to say thank you, in which case you are a recipient of that gift on the part of the municipality. Maybe it's a sculpture or something like that. You can also be asked or presented with the opportunity to receive gifts which you benefit from personally, whether it's rider's tickets or whether it's, somebody said last week a case of rye showed up at the office one day. So those kind of things as well, which are meant for personal consumption. So the question then becomes, which one is appropriate? Are they both okay? Are they not okay? And to which level? So we'll talk about that just a little bit later. So that was the question around ethics. This one we have talked a little bit about already, and that's whether the motivation of those of you who have chosen to serve your communities, either in an elected capacity or an administrative capacity. When I run across elected officials who would meet that bar of being ethical people, what I see from the vast majority of them are that they are people who want to make their communities better. They want to leave it better than they found it. They are people who want to serve the municipality. So they are there for the benefit of others primarily rather than themselves. And thirdly, they're the people who are not making a career of public service. For the majority of municipalities in this province and across the country, you couldn't make a career out of public service anyway. Unless you're a big city elected official, usually the remuneration just is not significant enough to make that work. So that tends not to be the case. But you end up being the big person in town because you're the mayor or the councillor of a town of 600 or 700 people. So there's some cachet in that, even if there's not a lot of money in it. So there's that piece too. So what made you choose to run the first time around? What made you choose to run the second time around? And what made you decide to get out at some point? Assuming you weren't democratically retired by the population. So, and then we hear stories in Canada too about elected officials who've been there for a very long time. And typically it's people like Hazel McCallion in Mississauga who'd been there for 40 years, something like that, as a elected official. And we hear, I think that makes the news because it's rare. It's not something that happens very, very frequently. Sometimes in small towns where there aren't very many people and we just kind of continue to choose the same people again and again, it still remains public service. And I think there's some value in that in terms of intrinsic motivation. When we're speaking about ethics, there we go. When we're speaking about ethics, these are some of the things that we frequently encounter. So when I work across Western Canada, there's very little in terms of ethical guidelines about or what ethics means that's put out by provincial governments or territorial governments. The list you see up here was put out by the government of BC, and I think it's actually pretty good. You might find some nuanced difference here in Saskatchewan, but I suspect it's going to be fairly similar to you. Legislation needs to be clear so that if you write legislation, so if you're writing bylaws on ethics, it needs to be clear so that future councils will understand it. You would have been part of that conversation when you generated a conflict of interest bylaw. Other councils wouldn't, or future councils may not, so making logic explicit really helps. The comment here shows about what conflict of interest is. When we're talking conflict of interest, by and large, we're talking pecuniary interest, which is a monetary benefit. So conflict of interest can be somewhat broad, but when we're talking about conflict, we're talking about, do I benefit personally? Does my employer benefit? Does my family benefit? And that's usually kind of the group of people that we see defined in terms of what conflict of interest is. We also see a difference sometimes between what's considered to be a real conflict of interest and what's a perceived conflict of interest. And there's when it comes to legislation, there isn't such a thing as a perceived conflict of interest. There is or there isn't. And this is where legal counsel typically has to get involved. And you will define some of what conflict of interest happens to be. When it's pecuniary and you benefit and your family benefits and your employer benefits, that's one thing. If your uncle is going to benefit, well, maybe that's perceived conflict of interest, but unless that's within the definition, it's not conflict of interest. We had a case for a small town mayor in central Alberta once who had rented a hangar at the local airport. And he asked whether or not, and the airport was owned by the town, and the town set lease rates on the hangars, of which he was an occupant. So the question then became, can he vote on the fees and charges that would see lease rates set at the hangars of the airport? The legal opinion was that he could, and the reason was because that tide was going to float all boats. It wasn't just him that was affected. If that was the case, that you can't vote on anything that has an impact on you at all, you could never vote on any fees and charges because you pay taxes to the municipality. Some of you probably get the occasional bylaw infraction for going too fast or running through a red light or something. Maybe you don't. I got one last week and I'm not happy about it. So those you can't. So it tends to be a narrower definition about if you benefit individually or as a family, it's a conflict. If the whole community benefits, or if there's a detriment to the whole community, then it's not a conflict. On here too is inside and outside influence. You are the big person in town, so you have influence over decisions. Somebody asked me in the first section after the session, he came up to me, a mayor, and he said, "I own a printing shop. Can I bid on work for the town?" Well, he can, but he has to recuse himself, of course. But he said there was some factually incorrect information that was being put out by whoever had written a request for a decision. Could he call the author and correct it? And my suggestion to him was don't, because even though that's not your employee, because you only have the one employee, even though that's not your employee, why don't you get your wife or somebody else in the company to phone? So you don't have even that perception of trying to influence in an inside way. There's outside influence here too. Again, because you're a big person in town, you carry more moral suasion because you're a fundamentally ethical person, that you can get decisions made potentially in your favor with outside groups as well, if they think it could eventually curry favor with the town. We've got some exceptions that happen with conflict of interest in some places because you are being asked to take a position on things which have a benefit to the whole community or change the whole community. And so sometimes you're asked to vote on things which are developing in zoning and things like this, which could have a long-term impact. I made a joke earlier about gifts, but it's a real thing because people understand that it's tangible. So if I use the example of rider's tickets or a bottle of wine or dinner, is it okay to accept by the way, that's a $10 gift card, so you're good.
It was a prize.
It's a prize, okay. It's purely, you offered. Thank you. So if the $10 is okay, is, I don't know, a $50 rider's ticket is okay? Is a $35 bottle of rye okay? Is $2,500 for a week in Mexico okay? Okay, so what's the difference? It's a gift, it's got a monetary value, the number's different, but that's all. Where do you set the line at the value of the gift that you are receiving? Do any of you have bylaws around that talk about we'll accept the gift of $10, but we won't accept a gift of more than X amount? What do you have? $150. Nice to see you again, by the way. $150? $300? Anybody else? $150? It's not an auction now. How much? $0. You can't accept gifts? That's boring. I was going to give you a Tim card. Somebody over here had one. No. So we're seeing like that 250 range now. A lot of people had $50 for a very long time, but it just seemed impractical. Now, this is where I should be just about wrapped up, because you want the ride. I'm a season ticket holder for the Eskimos, so I don't know why I'd want rider's tickets anyway, but there we go. Am I done? Okay. So then we talked about gifts. So the important thing, this is one of those cases where you want to close the barn door before the horse has left. So if you don't have a policy on gifts, or if it's zero, make it something realistic so that you know you are going to get something. Somebody buys you lunch, it's not a problem. If somebody tries to give you a vacation to Mexico, well, everybody seems to think I don't think it's a problem, I'd like that, but I'm in private business. So dictating what those things are before anything bad happens. And the last thing on here is around contracts. You may have come from private industry or private business to the municipality with a contract in hand to your business. The mayor last time may have had a contract to print signs for the town. That's something to be careful of and something to declare up front, that you could come in with contracts and they get a renewal and a renewal and a renewal. And there may be issues in ethics with that. And the last thing on here shows up at the use of insider information. And this is more so for when you leave office than when you're actually in office. You have the sum total of your experience in the 4 years or 8 years or however long you happen to have spent on council that you could use to your benefit after the fact, but should you? And if it's public information, that's fine. But a lot of you will have, probably all of you will have been involved in in-camera discussions about development or legal issues or employment issues. Can you use that outside the realm of your office once you're done? Everybody here will probably say no, and that's the right answer. But is there a chance that that might happen? Those of you with the firm ethical bedrock behind you won't have an issue with that. Anybody you've run into, maybe who's a little wishy-washy on their ethics, might feel free to leverage that in the future. And sometimes there are penalties as well. There's a significant number of penalties that range from everything from asking someone to provide an apology to maybe taking away some of their municipal resources. And sometimes that's based on not understanding your role. I was telling the earlier group, we did an investigation for the provincial minister of a municipality where the mayor saw his role as chief executive officer rather than chief elected official. And so what he had done was commit the town to things, sign contracts, sort of things he ought not to have been doing in a weak mayor system where he can't act without the permission of council. Anyway, council sanctioned him as much as they could, and they took away as many of his powers as they could through the term. He disagreed with council and said they didn't have the authority to do that. He disagreed so vehemently that the mayor sued his own council, which is not a great way to build rapport amongst a team. The judge sided with council and said, no, the council has gone through their due diligence, done what they should. It's the mayor who misunderstands the role. But the mayor still didn't think that he was doing anything wrong. He went through about 3.5 years of that term being sanctioned the whole time. But he was so strong in his convictions that he ran in the next election for mayor again. As an incumbent mayor, he received 5% of the vote. What that tells me is that people are watching, that you may think it's a small town and there's not a lot going on and people have better things to do, but people do pay attention to those people who have ethics. And in this case, the townspeople had had enough. They actually elected for mayor, they elected the former deputy mayor who'd been acting for the last 3.5 years, if you like. So that list isn't exhaustive, but it does give you food for thought. Another piece here is around freedom of information and protection of privacy. And you are privy to a lot of information that most people are not privy to. So I'll just leave these here and say that you've got things like the Local Government Act. For local government, you've got the Municipal Act, you've got the Cities Act, you've got LaFoIP. There's federal privacy legislation around PIPEDA as well. You also, probably because you're involved in your communities, you may be subject to other acts as well. And you think about which hat you're wearing at the time. Are there any conflicts between you acting, say, as a library trustee or an educator or a school board trustee, if you do, and somebody who's an elected official from a municipality? Just think where you're working. Also know about legislator paramountcy, which shows up here, and all that means is the higher the order of legislation, the more it comes into effect. For example, there's nothing that you could do that would be statutorily acceptable that conflicts with the Constitution of Canada. So if you were to discriminate against English immigrants like myself, that would be, I'm an immigrant by the way, I took a job away from a good hardworking Canadian. If you were to discriminate against a visible group and you were to do it by statute, that statute would be null and void insofar as the conflict existed because it ran counter to the Canadian Constitution. So there's nothing that you write in statute that can conflict with a provincial act or that can conflict with a federal statute. Now, it doesn't wipe out everything that you do, just the portion where the conflict lies. So knowing about these things in advance will help you remain ethical. Where am I? That's where I should have been, sorry. So we're going to talk a bit about conflict of interest, which we've already talked a bit. So we talked about pecuniary interest already, and there is conflict of interest that does show up in the acts. We've talked about real conflict of interest versus perceived conflict already, and the conflict must benefit that subset of council. If it's all of council, then you're okay. You must vote. This is where some legislation changes around the country. In BC, where am I? In Saskatchewan, you have to vote, but you can abstain, and an abstention is listed as a no vote. Now, the issue that comes with that is, under Robert's rules, if you have a tie vote, a resolution is lost. So you're essentially adding to the losing side. And the reason the resolution is lost is Robert says, in order for something to happen, for something to move forward, a majority of people need to be in favor. If it's a tie vote, as it would be, say, a conflict of interest and somebody recused himself, if there's not a majority to move in favor, the resolution fails, which is why a tie vote would fail under Robert's rules. So which is why a no vote here has an impact. In some other places, in Alberta, for example, it's mandatory to vote unless you're in conflict of interest. They call it just pecuniary interest, or if you missed a public hearing. But you have to vote. And you can actually be disqualified from office if you don't vote when you were supposed to vote. So things change, things are different around the province, or sorry, around the country. The basic advice on this is to get legal advice. But when you get legal advice, it can come from a couple of places. It can come from the municipality's lawyer, whether that's a staff lawyer or whether that's somebody that the municipality has on retainer. Or if it's a case of a personal issue around conflict of interest or your potential for conflict of interest, then my advice is to get your own personal legal opinion, to keep and have it beforehand. So again, you manage to close that barn door before the horse has left. When we talk about this, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because you'll understand it. You'll know this stuff. You're a good chunk of the way through the term. When we do orientations for council, sometimes we've actually done orientations for candidates even before nomination day to not weed people out, but to help people understand what the job actually entails. That if you're just running because you're mad about the dogs, maybe it's other ways to do that. Or if you don't understand the time commitment of a council meeting, maybe there's other ways to do that. But anyway, so when we talk about this, you have various roles, things like leadership. There's that quote that Alice in Wonderland had said, if you don't know where, the Cheshire Cat says to Alice, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Your job as a council is to identify that road so that you can tell the Cheshire Cat to step in the tree, keep grinning, but just leave me alone. If you have a vision for your community, what success looks like a generation from now, you can bite off the next 4-year chunk and set a reasonable chance of success so you know where you should be working and where you can't be working. So if you have a vision for success and you have a strategic plan, and when we do strategic plans, we often recommend that they overlap the electoral term by a year. So you start the new year with a new term with an already existing strategic plan. Council can get its feet under it for a year before it has to develop its own new plan. So it's always leapfrogging a little bit. So you're the leaders, you're setting that vision. You're setting the values as well. And what values are kind of the lens or filter through which you would make decisions or choose not to make decisions. A lot of those end up being ethical as well. One that frequently comes up, and it comes up so often now that I'm not really sure what it means anymore, is transparency. And what transparency means different things to different people. But what it does say is that if we, as a local government, as council, say one of our values is to be transparent, and we are presented with a decision to make that reduces that transparency, is it really a decision we ought to be making? And that's how it gets back to being part of your values and part of your ethics and the judgment that you've got to make that way. You're in charge of decision making. I talked earlier about if all the decisions were easy, you would only need one of you there. But the decisions aren't easy. You're talking about the future of your community. Stephen Covey says, start with the end in mind. Natural Step talks about backcasting. And the idea behind that is, if you have a good idea where you want to end up, you know where you are today, you can make choices to get where you want to go. But those choices can sometimes be difficult and sometimes be conflicting. And my definition of politics is it's the art of conflict management. Now, conflict not meaning fisticuffs, although I have seen that when we're looking at some of these municipalities. But the idea behind conflict here is conflicting ideas. That if we're all there with our firm ethical base, we want to make decisions in the best interest for our community for the long term, we are not necessarily going to agree. We know what the top of the mountain is, but we want to take different paths up to the top of that mountain, and that's okay. That's where the health comes in, and that's where the beauty of debate comes in too. So you're in charge of making those decisions. You're also a public conduit. People want to talk to the municipality, they want to talk to you. They know you, they voted for you, they see you at church, they see you in the grocery lines. They don't know that they should be talking to a director or the CAO or somebody else. They're going to talk to you too. So you do know that process and can steer it in the right direction. We've talked about dispute resolution, internal disputes or external disputes. You represent your community. You are within an RM as well and within neighboring communities, and there will be disputes around that too. So how do you deal with some of those sorts of things? You're there as a steward of scarce resources. Yeah, much like decision making, if you had all the money and time and people in the world, you wouldn't all need to be there. You'd just be everything to everybody, but you're not. So you have to figure out what's the best way to make use of those dollars that you've got available to you. And so that's how you become a wise steward, not only for now, but for later. And I ask this question when it comes to debt sometimes, because some people are just vehemently opposed to taking on debt. I get it. Some people are pretty free with futures money. But what's the best way to get the best bang for your buck, to provide the value that gets you towards achieving your vision that 25 years down the road? Debt is a tool like any other, but you need to be wise about that. You are community leaders. You probably were community leaders before. You'll probably be community leaders after, but during the time of your elected time, you're community leaders too. So you are expected to meet with people, to represent people, and to listen. I find when I sit down with an elected official, one-on-one or in a small group, one of the first things I pay attention to is, do they talk a lot or do they listen a lot? And I find those people who listen a lot often learn pretty well and represent their communities well. Sometimes I find that those people who talk an awful lot either are insecure or trying to defend things, and I don't know what they're trying to defend half the time, but maybe they think if they just keep talking, they'll cover all their bases. But I think listening is really important and a really healthy thing to do. This is just I'm a member of the Institute of Certified Management Consultants of Canada. And we were given a couple of tools, and I adapted this one to use. And this talks about factors which influence ethical decisions. And it says for an ethical decision to be present, these have to be here. For those of you who are interested, this image will show up on the slides that will be posted to the website. You're welcome to take pictures if you want, but I believe it'll be there later anyway. But this says that for a factor that influences ethical decisions, you need to have options, you need to have personal ethics, you need to have a code of conduct, all of which you've got. There are laws that will apply. The society itself will have norms, which gets to culture of our local areas. And finally, we've got the municipal ethics. So how your own community operates. So if these things are present, this is objective. You add a layer of subjectivity to the top of this to determine whether that is present or not, and if it is present, then you've got ethical decisions. So the next one here is about checklists for ethical decision making. This is another one of those tools that I was given as part of the management consultant's certification. And it says, first of all, if I'm going to make an ethical decision, this is kind of a decision tree, if you like. Will my action be legal, fundamentally? Does my action comply with my code of ethics? Is it in the best interest of the municipality as a whole? There are 7 of these if anybody's waiting for the end to take a picture. As a decision maker, do you have a pecuniary interest or a conflict of interest? Would I tell my colleagues or my family? So if my mom finds out, would I be okay with it? Am I doing the right thing for myself? And finally, can I justify my course of action? So if you can go through this list and answer it in the way that you think is most appropriate to you, yes or no. Some of these are yes answers, some of these are no answers. It shouldn't be that difficult to figure out which is which. If you can go through this, you can then present to yourself that you're making an ethically based decision. So we'll talk a bit about wise practices in ethics. Let's skip the next one. Skip that one. Go to tone. Just looking at the clock here, we started a little late. There's a concept called tone at the top. A colleague of mine, a fellow by the name of George Cuff, who many of you know, George and I worked together a fair bit, and it's taught me a lot over the years around tone at the top. And he talks about essentially a cascade. And he says that council sets the political tone for the organization, administration sets the management tone, and you got to stay in your lane. That if council abrogates its requirements to do work Administration will quite happily fill that gap. That's okay. But what you end up with then is a caretaker organization, not a governance organization. And if you're okay with that, fine. If you want to make your community better over the years, that's not how it goes. We require respect for the CAOs, and so for that we require things like making sure there are job descriptions, making sure there are regular reviews, making sure we're speaking respectfully in public at least of our CAOs. And then how you do business around change management and risk management. If we look at, where are we? If we look at how tone cascades, it comes from the top down. You said it. You as elected officials said it. Your council members council is critical in this factor. And it starts with the decorum that you show the public. I've been to many a small communities council meeting where we have a nice chat between the elected officials in the gallery, where we're using first names, where we may or may not make formal motions. Business gets done. Problem happens 6 months, 2 years later, when all of a sudden we need that decorum because we've got some problem that's appeared or about to appear, and council has no idea how to run a formal meeting. There's no understanding, for example, of the interaction between the public and between council and the public, that a public meeting isn't really a public engagement session. It's public in that the public can come and watch the business of government happening, but their job is not to interact. And I hear that sometimes, so they're there to watch. So I've heard criticism sometimes when council is set up facing the gallery, and immediately in front of council, the administration is facing council with their backs to the gallery. To me, that's okay, because the meeting is between council and administration. The public is there as a check on it more than anything else. So here are some of the other examples of tone. How you treat managers, the comments that you make publicly, whether they're on the record or off the record, the comments that managers make to staff, the service that you provide, which is fundamentally why you're there, and then your public engagement, your websites, your social media, all those kind of things are issues around tone. When we're setting tone, these are some of the pieces that we're looking for too. Confidence, respect, guidance, the things that you set in advance. When we're talking about ethics, these are some of the things that an ethical person would do without them having to be written down. I'm going to skip the privacy thing here. Social media I do want to hit on though, just look with an eye to the clock. This is becoming more of an issue. Community is changing. Community used to be defined geographically. Me, my neighbors, my street, sometimes my community on large issues. Now community is more and more defined by interest. My wife's Red Wine Club, for example, or church groups, or the curling club. They're grouped based on interest, not geographically. Maybe in the same town, but different groups of people that meet together. And the consistency for me is I'm at the center of my own Venn diagram of all of these groups in the same way that everybody else does. So community changes. And we interact with each other more and more electronically now, and that's taken some of the personality out of it. Sometimes elected officials will have Facebook profiles or Twitter profiles or Instagram feeds, and have been using them for years. When you get to office, what do? Do you keep going with just using that feed still? Or do you now set up something that's specific to you as an elected official? So now you have Ian McCormick, councillor, and Ian McCormick, citizen. And how do you keep the two apart? Do you use anonymous accounts? Sometimes it gets really frustrating because the other groups that are out there, the Facebook groups, the Coffee Clatch, the group that meets at A&W on Tuesday afternoon, that self-appointed Senate that every community seems to have, tend not to be there to sing your praises. They tend to point out to you what you're doing wrong, and they will do it quite happily, quite vehemently. They're not bound by the same rules you are, so maybe you get frustrated. You set up your own own anonymous account. Do you do that sort of thing? I would suggest you don't. One of the reasons being because if you're using municipal tools to do that, the tools would be likely be subject to freedom of information legislation, and so what you'd hope to keep quiet may not remain quiet. You also represent your community's reputation. So what you do on social media is broadcast not only to your community, but to the world as well. Talk about public and in-camera meetings. In-camera is a really important thing. So you are given the freedom to discuss some things in camera that you wouldn't normally discuss, aren't allowed to discuss in public. That list is pretty short. If we are called into a municipality that isn't working well, the first place we look is, what was supposed to be in camera that is no longer in camera or that got out? How did it get out and who did it? So that's one of the things we'll really have a look for. So are things being dealt with in camera? So this is one of those pieces around decorum too. Where am I? Oh, I'm way behind you guys. You should tell me this. Pitfalls, common issues. There we go. I'm going to wrap up quite soon, but I just want to talk about some of the potential, the pitfalls that you could run into. One of which is that proverbial boiling frog, where the frog's in the cold water, they turn the heat up, frog boils to death. It's not a happy ending. So the case may be, and I asked the question earlier about tickets or about gifts. Is the Tim's card is okay? Is the rider's tickets okay? Is the vacation to Mexico okay? If you don't have that dollar figure set on gifts, you can keep ratcheting them that heat, and all of a sudden you're in a lot of trouble. People know when you're okay, like with that $10 gift card. People know when you're not okay with that vacation, but where in the middle where is that gray line in the middle, and how do we avoid that? Entitlement, too, shows up. If you're a counselor, you're probably not making a whole lot of money as a counselor. Maybe you feel you put in more time than you get rewarded for. Maybe taking those tickets so that vacation's an okay thing to do, besides everybody else does it. It becomes a bit of a pitfall. And it's especially a pitfall if other people are doing the same thing. If you're saying to your council mates that it's okay that they accept a night out someplace, and they say, well, it's okay if you accept a night out someplace, you are dealing with each other most of the time rather than focusing outwards. So it's hard to tell where the ethical breach might lie. So you're all in the same boat, and you want to be careful that you manage it properly. You've got to, if you want to, avoiding some of these pitfalls around encouraging virtuous cycles and breaking vicious ones. You are probably an outspoken person. I suspect there aren't a lot of type B people who get involved in elected office. So holding each other to account is important, whether it's through a piece of paper, your code of ethics, your oath of office, your statutes, or whether it's an agreement that we as a council, some councils have charters that says this is how we will act even beyond just the code of ethics. Yeah, I'll leave that. Culture is here too. I'm just going to get quickly into a couple of resources. Some of these you may be familiar with, some of them won't. I've got citations for them a little bit later. But the first book is a really old one, John Carver's Boards That Make a Difference. It's about governance boards, and it talks, it's still got some real good stuff in it. I think it's published in 1990. But it really talks about the difference between a working board, like you may have had with like a school council, and a governance board, like you've got right now. The next one is Leonard Eightdale's book about nurturing ethics in local government. The third book there, Mayor's Gone Bad, is one of my favorites. It's a Canadian book about mayors that have done things that perhaps they ought not to have done. A lot of them are associated with places like Montreal and Toronto and that sort of thing, where you get involved with people you ought not to get involved in. There's some really good messages there about what not to do. There are some good mayors in there too. That was published probably 4 or 5 years ago by a guy named Philip Slayton. And the third book is just an example. It's one of Cuff's guides for municipal leaders. George Cuff has a lot of material out there, and probably many of you have encountered him at one time or another. George is a polarizing guy. People either love him or hate him. I'm a fan, so he's there too. Let's get a couple here. So where we look at some of the tools and the people that you've got, there are tools on the left-hand side and people on the right. These are places and tools and things and people you can rely on either to get you out of trouble or to prevent you from getting in trouble in the first place. That checklist for ethical decisions I talked about the list from is it legal, would I tell my mom, all that stuff. Legislative Paramount is here about understanding which order of government will reign supreme in a conflict of legislation. Tools that SUMA or other organizations might provide are there too. On the right-hand side, if you have trusted colleagues, whether they are current council members or former council members who understand what it's like in the trenches, even if they don't know what exactly the issues are of the day, those are good people. We're seeing more things like freedom of information contacts, integrity commissioners and ethics commissioners that some municipalities are now starting to hire in advance. And those people are there. I served as an ethics commissioner for the city of St. Albert, just outside Edmonton, for a while. And the idea behind that was twofold. One was in advance to help local government officials understand what ethical conduct is and what it looks like in reality. And the second is if there are complaints, to deal with those complaints from an external, third-party, independent perspective, which we do. And then legal counsel I've mentioned too, and there's an important set about legal counsel, whether it's your legal counsel or whether it's the municipalities and when you might use it. Last comment here is on codes of ethics. You've got a code of ethics. Interestingly, the term ethics isn't, to my knowledge anyway, I couldn't find it, isn't defined in the act, in any of your acts. So what constitutes ethics is not defined, but the fact that you should act ethically is required. And so there is a little bit of potential for gray areas showing up, I've seen. This is, I just put this up here for the benefit of anybody who's looking at this online. So I had that list of the 7 factors associated with ethical decision making. This is the same thing, but just shown as a decision-making tree. Some people might find it easier to look at it this way than just that cascading list. It's really just the same information. Here are those resources I referenced. So Leonard Eightdale's book, George Cuff's books, Philip Slayton's books, and John Carver's book. These are up here. They will be available on the website too. So if you want to have a look at what some of the resources I've used through this is. That brings me, I've run out of slides. So this must bring me to the end of the presentation. We started, there's that saying about if you're going to start late, you might as well make up for it by leaving early. I think we're done a couple of minutes earlier than we had initially planned to be done. But there's intended to be, and I know kickoff's about to start. I don't care. I'm not an NFL fan. I have Eskimos tickets. We've been through this. If you do have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them here. After the session, I'm more than happy to help you out with them as well. If I don't run into you again, I hope you have a great conference. And I really love local government. I love having the opportunity to come and speak to people who also share a passion for local government. So thank you all so much for your attention, unless anybody has questions.
Hello?
Just do it and dance.
Actually.
Oh, it's an online quiz. This is high tech. One of you. If a member of the council or mayor resign for his or her personal reasons due to his or her current job requires them to resign, but on their resignation letter they put a reason to take a stab at current council negatively, is that ethical? Well, I'll give you that back because I'm going to lose it or drop it or something. That's an interesting question. I suppose speakers are always supposed to say that. It is an interesting question because one of the pieces that showed up here on ethics is speak well of each other, particularly in public. If you're going to criticize the issue, not the person. I would say that would border on unethical. I don't know if anybody listened to that, listening to me repeat the question would have other input on that based on their own reality. But I would suggest that indicates kind of gray area or not so good area in terms of personal ethics, which has come out into local government ethics as well.
If you're a counselor,
Speak closely.
okay. If you're a counselor,
Yeah, this isn't going to work either to show me. Sorry.
if you're a counselor and another counselor at your table, you know that they have a conflict of interest. Can you call them out, or how do I, as a counselor, how do you handle that situation where you know that they're not declaring?
The question was, if I know another member of council is in a conflict of interest, but they have not declared, what do I do about it? That's a time I would speak to the CAO, speak to the lawyer, but your job is not to call out somebody else on conflict. If they are in a conflict, they're the ones who have to deal with it and the ramifications of it. So I would try and get them to avoid it by conversation, but you can't force them. Ask them to go get a legal opinion too.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much, Ian. Great presentation. I'm going to speak without a mic because we only have the portable one. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. Ian will be around for a couple more minutes because he cheers for the Eskimos. So.